Evolutionary.org presents Evolutionary Hardcore Podcast with your co-hosts, Steve from the American Underground and Mobster from the UK Iron Den. Get ready for the most hardcore and underground info in the industry. And here we go. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6.
Evolutionary.org hardcore podcast coming your way. Stevesmi here. And the Mobster, we're doing J D Dawodu, episode 162. What's up, Mobster? How you doing, man?
Oh, good. We're going for a British slant today, guys. So there might be a little bit of slang in there and a little bit of the UK scene, so especially back in the day when JD was kicking it.
So who is this guy? JD, one of the most under the radar pro bodybuilders from the 90s and 2000. He wasn't in a lot of magazines and he wasn't involved in a lot of marketing stuff like some of the other guys. He didn't place as high as other guys of his era due to that reason. So we see this a lot in other sports as well. You see people who are overrated, like, you know, you'll see guys doing like 5-6 commercials and they're like average players as professional football players or basketball players. And a lot of the other players that are much better than them, they won't get these commercials because you're just not marketable. So I think he was kind of the same way. One thing that was kind of cool about JD is he did play a small role in the movie The Fifth Element. That was a sci-fi movie by Bruce Willis. I don't know if you ever saw that movie, Mops. You saw it?
Oh yeah, I've got it on my DVD collection. It's a big movie. Luc Besson is the director. Yeah. He's one of my favorite directors as well.
I actually saw it when it came out in the theater. So yeah, I don't remember JD being in it, so I'll have to rewatch it again and try to see if I can spot him in the movie. But he played a small role. So yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, jump in here. He's actually one of the henchmen of the baddie. And you've got the scene when the religious guy turns up in the baddie's office, and you've got all the muscular henchmen standing around. JD's one of those fellas.
Yeah, guys. So check that out. If you guys are a fan of that movie, there's a lot of people who are big fans of sci-fi movies, especially around that time. So it was a kind of a funny sci-fi movie. So it's really worth the listen to if you haven't seen it yet. He was born in 1965, and he's also from Britain, just like the Mobster here. Via Nigeria was where his ancestors were from. 5'7", so he's about my height, and he's 250 pounds ripped at competition, and in the off season, a massive, absolutely massive 270 pounds. So let's kind of talk about his competitions at first. I know Mobster has a lot of stuff on him. 1992 British Championships, he won. 4 years later, he went pro at 30 years old. So he had a late pro and you know, he was late to be a pro. He says he took time off to make adjustments. So that's kind of cool. Late start. He only had a short window to make a name for himself. 18 major contests throughout his 30s. That was when he was peaking. 96, he was able to compete at Mr. Olympia due to an invite. But oddly enough, he refused to go. He wanted to qualify outright. He ended up finishing fourth in several tough competitions, and he was 17th at Mr. Olympia in 2001. So that was kind of cool that he had that type of mentality. Now, his best known features, his wide chest, tight waist, so he had that V, and he had huge biceps. So when you're 5'7", typically you have shorter limbs, and you're able to build those biceps huge. And that's what he was able to do. Extremely dense body, but it is said his conditioning may have knocked him down some spots in the competitions and prevented him from being at his top. So 2002 Southwest Pro, he should have taken first place, but ended up at fourth. His conditioning just wasn't right at the competition day. You've got to have your conditioning in top form. And even though he was the top bodybuilder there, everyone agreed he ended up getting fourth because of his poor conditioning. So Grand Prix England, 1996, Mobster, 7th. IFBB Night of Champions, 7th that same year. Arnold Classic, 14th in 2000. Pro Invitational Ironman in 2011. Night of Champions, 12th in 2000. So he was doing well all through. And then 2001 was when he got 17th at Mr. Olympia, 4th at the Grand Prix Australia, 9th at the Arnold Classic, and 4th at the Ironman Pro. So 2000, 2001 was when he really tore it up. So, and then the next year, Southwest Pro, he got 4th, Night of Champions, 9th, and then Toronto Pro, he got 12th. And then his last major competition was the Ironman Pro Invitational, where he was top 10 in 2003. Social media, we get into this a little bit. His stance on social media, he's not a fan of social media. And I'll bring in Mobster.
I was just going to say a couple of things. We've mentioned already he's got a Nigerian background, and there might be an argument here for Nigerian genetics, slightly thicker skin, and they also tend to hold a little tiny bit of body fat, even when they're super muscular. I'm thinking, for example, a very freak of freaks back in the day, Victor Richard, with a Nigerian background. There's also worth mentioning, Steve, when it comes to competitions. When it comes to competitions, you're looking at less pro cards here in the UK. For one reason or another, especially back when JD was competing. You've got competitions in the States right now where I believe, for example, recent competition, one of the qualifiers for the Olympia across multiple classes, including wellness, etc. And I believe 120 pro cards was handed out. Back in the day, even at the competition that you mentioned already, which would be the English Grand Prix, to get that, you might have had one pro card in the male open class for the whole year as an opportunity. So again, that, and what you also refer to, this thing with him saying of wanting to qualify for a competition rather than getting an invite, proving, of course, that you are worthy. We've had a few things mentioned with regards to the Arnold recently, where you said if a person can't qualify for the Arnold, how are they expected to do real well at the Olympia? Because if they didn't get an invite and they didn't qualify, you know, it's kind of like there's a, you're not qualifying, you're not good enough. You're not good enough for this competition, you're not going to be good enough for the biggest competition. So him having a mindset back in the day is on point. I'll go back to you for a second with regards to social media, Steve, and then I'll jump right back in if that's okay with you on the social media.
So he doesn't have a big social media following, and he doesn't like the limelight. He doesn't like to be out of the center of attention, which is not surprising. A lot of bodybuilders say, I used to do a lot of theater myself, and I'm not a fan of the limelight either. So I'm not on social media. Mobster has a very small social media. We just don't want to, you know, be out there. We'd like to kind of stay underground. We'd like to do these podcasts and be underground. That's kind of the cool thing. We have a nice small group of followers, you know, who follow our stuff, but we don't want to be seen by millions of people. We don't want to be Arnold. We don't want to be The Rock, you know, and get so many followers.
I'll jump in here for a second, Stephen. Something you and I talked about in the pre-show, and we've mentioned this as well, guys. It's well worth stating. First off, to get to a decent level in social media is work, and I mean work. When, for example, 1 hour video on reviewing, say, for example, something like a burger cooker, a grill, a George Foreman grill. You're talking about something that might take you 20 or 30 minutes to film, but then there's 2 or 3 hours of editing, it's all the tagging and all the rest of that stuff. And something Steve and I have mentioned in previous podcasts, that it's not uncommon for people that do social media to not actually do it themselves. They will hire other people. They will hire social media companies, specifically on Instagram. They'll work with an Instagram company, again, in terms of getting the numbers and the likes up and adding followers and all that kind of stuff. And I've used Larry Wills as an example. Larry, I believe, pays his videographer the money that's earned from YouTube, and then takes the money that's earned from the products that are mentioned during these videos and the podcast, et cetera, and makes the money for that. So it's in the videographer's interest to make the video as good as possible, because he'll generate more income for himself. So there is that. And I suspect, which we'll get into in a little bit with JD, if it's not fun for JD, he's not interested. And we'll get into that in a little bit in terms of doing what you do with regards to this kind of stuff, Stephen, enjoying it. So as you say, I mean, for me, it's a job. If my mortgage is paid and my bills are paid, I don't have a mortgage that's been paid for years, then it's how much work do I want to do for that much more money? Do I need more money? No. I suspect JD, for want of a better phrase, has got his shit covered. And so it just literally said, you know what, it's too much hassle, it's too much work. I don't want to put myself out there. So he doesn't. We've looked at the combined total of Facebook and Instagram, just about 6,000 tops. Anyway, back to you, Steve.
So let's kind of get into the next phase here. We're going to talk about his nutrition, his training, his mindset. I'm going to bring in Mobster shortly to cover most of this, but let me talk a little bit about what JD talks about in terms of rest. So he believes in hard work in the gym and putting in the hours, but he also believes you must get good quality sleep and rest so those muscles can grow. So it's very, very important. Good quality sleep, guys and gals, that's going to be the key to rest and recovery. That's when your body starts repairing itself at the cellular level. So if you're going and you're killing yourself in the gym, you're working your butt off, you're spending hours in the gym, and you're only getting 3, 4, 5 hours of sleep, it's just not going to work. For your body, there's not enough time for your body to repair the kind of trauma. You're putting all that stress and all that trauma on your body. It doesn't make any sense. So you really want to aim to at least 7, 8, even 8.5 hours of sleep every night consistently. Sleep is one of those things that I talk about all the time. I've been studying sleep since I was 6, 7 years old. I was on an airplane when I was younger, and there was a magazine, and I was reading the magazine, and there was an article about sleep, and I just started studying sleep from a really young age. I've been studying it ever since. I've been obsessed with sleep quality. And you see guys like Tom Brady, they sleep in a soundproof room on expensive beds and expensive sheets, expensive pillows, no sound, no light. There's nothing else in the room except the bed. That is completely what he does for his sleep. And look at it, he's still going strong. I mean, he's going to play almost till he's 50. So, I mean, this is very important in bodybuilding, even more important than other sports, because in bodybuilding, you are trashing your muscles, your ligaments, your tendons. Everything's getting trashed, and you need to heal afterwards. Another thing he's very passionate about is about social media. And he thinks social media is ruining the sport because people with 1 million followers, and Mobster touched on this earlier, they're posting their training online and not even doing the movements correctly. So what it is, you know, it's not, you have these social media influencers, and many of them are crap, you know, and they buy the followers, they do stupid things for clicks, and they build a big social media following. And when you do that, you can start advertising for this supplement, for that energy drink. It's all the same shtick, okay? And then you start putting up pictures of yourself with a rented Lamborghini, and then you call up a escort agency and you get 4 or 5 women, and you pay them each $200 to come out and do a shoot with you in a jacuzzi. It's the same shit with all these fucking clowns. So he's absolutely right. I mean, it annoys me. I know it annoys you, Mobster, but yeah, it's just for clicks. And, you know, we're not impressed. I'm not impressed with anybody who has to rent women to act like they're spending time with them. And then you meet these people, because a lot of them live in my area. You meet them in person, and they're driving a Honda, and they have a wife and 3 kids. And there you see them in the supermarket on Saturday afternoon with their wife and bratty kids running around screaming. And it's like, wow, this is the guy who drives a Lamborghini. This is the guy who's got 5 women in the hot tub. And then they're basically just frauds is what they are. So I'm completely on his side on that. But on the other hand, you know, social media can be a positive. And I talk about it in the article. If you guys read the article, you have to find the guys on social media who are motivational, positive, and actually know what they're talking about, because those people are out there. And sometimes those people only have 2,000 or 3,000 followers. You see, you have to find those right people. And that's the people I actually, check out online. So Mobster, I'll let you talk a little bit about his training and more information about your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in here, Steve. So, for example, the phrase that "keep it real" seems to be most appropriate here. Guys, you can find examples of JD training back in the day. If you search for Ballistic, JD Ballistic training, there's a series of videos, probably off some VHS cassette back in the day, 15, 20 minutes at a time, training different body parts. What's interesting from that, and it kind of echoed with me, both for the training when I was competing in my regular time back in Gloucester, before I moved up to where I live now in South Wales, and even the whole London vibe, which comes across. JD training at that time, and probably still is, in a famous in the UK gym in London called Muscleworks, and the original Muscleworks is a hardcore gym. Big, it looks like you could take all the equipment out, redecorate, and put it all back in, but they never have. They just put this big fuck off dumbbells, heavy rubber mats on the floor. Everything looks like it's been built into an extension, and then, we've added a leg room, we've added this. It's not some super warehouse type place or whatever else. I never took the trek, and I wish I had. And what you get from the time there, which I touched on with Steve in the pre-show, there was an element for me, and I think what comes across, which is basically, if there's a serious group of you, and in the videos with JD there's 2 or 3 pro bodybuilders in the gym, or want to be pro bodybuilders as well, in the gym with JD for a lot of the time. Maybe the fella that's spotting you isn't, but the camera pans around and he literally calls out 2 other guys in there. And then we're not talking about that kind of rival vibe that sometimes comes across. It's literally, there's my mate. He wants to be an ass-kicking bodybuilder too. He's doing his shit. I'll big him up. And everybody looks like they're having fun. Something that JD talks about, he says, training because you love it, competing because you love it, doing this shit because you love it. If there's some element of it that he didn't like the social media, he just wasn't going to do it. And in fact, the video that Steve and I refer to in the article and use as a reference point for this podcast is one where he's hitting up another buddy from that time, Eddie Abu, who was, funny enough, just outside of London. Eddie's still involved. And in fact, a mate of mine refers to Eddie for certain amounts of advice, etc. So keeping it old school, keeping it basic, keeping it on point. But the back and forth, the banter between these 2 guys, which seems to come across with some of the UK bodybuilders when you're on the American media, RX Muscle, MD, etc. There's and even with Steve and I, when we're at the end of these podcasts we do off air, there's a bit of banter. There's a kind of fun and enjoying what you're doing aspect to it. And perhaps that's been lost somewhat in the more social media motivated and even more professional, hungry for every kind of dollar vibe, which there doesn't need to be. I'll get into the training now because it's something else that's interesting. But just remember, guys, when it comes to this kind of stuff, you're meant to do it because you enjoy it. If you want to compete and you diet and you moan about diet and you chose to do that shit, you chose to go on stage, you chose to lift weights. So fucking enjoy yourselves. Do this thing because it's a passion and you like it. Right, training. JD, I'm going to specifically refer to this ballistic stuff. You can see it for yourself. And I've seen this a couple of times and I kind of wondered why some people do it. But he explains with it like a voiceover, a little picture-in-picture voiceover where he says he's doing what appears to be partial range of movements. He's literally just working the muscle through a certain range of movement. So, for example, the one that springs to mind right now is doing like an incline chest. I think it's on some sort of hammer strength machine, and the arms are definitely not coming all the way up. And it's one of those things where you're probably seeing the work set on these videos. So he's got to this work set, the muscle's already fatigued, and now he's just working it for that range of movement that he wants specifically to aim for a certain development in the chest in that area. And it's one of those things you're only going to lock out or put straight in your arms at 8, 6, 7, 8th rep. The rest of the reps are within a shorter range of movement. Lots of drop sets. There's a bunch of stuff on there. And again, he's probably coming up to a competition when he's doing his videos. So it's one of those things when you are, as Steve, I've done drop sets. I'm sure Steve's have, even though I train for strength, I've done drop sets in the past. It is, especially if you're in competition mode and you're dieting down for competition, fucking horrible to do on a regular basis. When Steve talks about needing that sleep and recovery, he's not kidding, because you really are trying to get into that kind of place where you are tearing down as much muscle fiber or stimulating as much growth as you possibly can. And it's just not a nice thing to do. And it's one of those kind of things, unless you're using real lightweights, which JD is not. These not massive, stupid, crazy 200-pound dumbbells or whatever, but certainly when, you know, we're talking 11, 12 plates aside on the leg press with 25 kilogram plates. So it's 500-600 kilograms, and which is 1,200-1,300 pounds for you American guys. And there's constant tension on the quads, for example, 3, 4, 5 plates aside on these hammer machines, constant tension on the pecs, and then taking a couple of plates off and doing more reps when you're already fatigued. To do that again and again and again, and PEDs will, of course, help, and we'll get into that shortly. That is really, really hard. It's really, really brutal. And sometimes, which is a bit of a shame, when we're watching top professional bodybuilders or top professional athletes now, there's sometimes a semblance of not this kind of training, that you're almost, it's what we used to call, you know, the spray on oil and the spray on sweat, that kind of stuff. And they're not giving you the stuff where the snot's coming out the nose. They're not showing you the stuff where their eyeballs are bulging out of the head, that kind of thing. Back on to something else with regards to keeping it real as well. This goes all the way back through to Weider. Weider was forever presenting back in the day this idea that the top American bodybuilders, especially on the West Coast, we live in some great, crazy lifestyle. So a lot, you either had photographs in the gym or you had photographs on the beach. And of course, there was always a girl hanging off your arm and the guys were goofing around, etc., etc. And reality, of course, that some of those guys were living in camper vans in the gym car park. I can think of one bodybuilder that slept on the roof. Other guys would sleep underneath the boardwalk. So, and Tom Platz talks about sharing, I think they had an apartment where, because he was the competing bodybuilder, he got the sofa. But I believe he was sharing it at one point with 20 other people, you know, for how many dollars, and like $10 a night or something crazy like this. So what the images that are presented to you versus reality. So for me, and I think Steve is like this as well, keep it fucking real. Training should be hard, should be brutal, should be brief. You're going to need to sleep because you should be fucking exhausted. Food can sometimes almost be tiring to do. It should not be made out to be less than what it is. And sometimes social media can kind of put a nice glow to this kind of stuff because you want to sell yourself, you want to sell the sport, and you want to attract sponsors. But even getting a sponsor can be a job of work. So we keep this stuff real. We keep it real on Evo. We keep it real on this. This is called a hardcore podcast for a fucking reason, guys. So there's that element to it. I will talk about, before we get into the PEDs this day, three more things. One is back in the day, even when he was a pro, he had a day job. He never completely gave up earning an income from something else outside the sport. And maybe they'll see another advantage for not having too much of a reliance on, even back in the day, at the beginnings of social media, which would have been around 1990 or so. And certainly up to the time when he was still competing, which was in the early 2000s. He says, and I'll touch on this very quickly, he won't coach female bodybuilders, and he addresses it specifically because of the extremes that we're seeing now, and in the video that Steve referred to a couple of years ago, the extremes with regards to diuretics, the extremes with regards to fat burners, DMP, and thyroid drugs that we're seeing women, even when he's talking about that, we've seen worse in literally the last 6 months. If JD's talking a couple of years ago on an MD video of the extremes, and in literally as this podcast has gone out, I think in the last 2 to 3 months, Steve, we've probably lost, in fact, we're doing a podcast on someone else soon, we've probably lost 12 names, perhaps 15 names for the sport. And the majority of those have been on the female side. And that seems to have come down, the general consensus has come down to the crazy stuff that the women are doing, worse than the men. And the men make up the majority of bodybuilding. So the idea that, you know, the guys are doing crazy stuff, no, it appears to be the women are doing the worst and damaging themselves. So he said specifically won't deal with that. One more thing, and of course, PEDs are seen sometimes as a secret, but I'll address this just the same. JD talks about younger athletes looking for shortcuts. And on our forums and on these podcasts, we occasionally talk about the younger athletes that come onto the forums and they're asking for what drug that they can take. I'm kind of cold on this stuff, and I come across in a certain way, and I'm happy to do so. 25 is it. And for me, 25 is as long as it's going to take you to learn your shit. That's nutrition and your training and your rest and recovery. And you can sit down and research and research and research. I'm happy for you to do so. But really, you're not fully matured, especially in your endocrine system, until you get to 25. Now, you might be a genetic freak and maybe you mature earlier. I don't give a fuck. I can't be bothered rolling those dice. I don't know who you are. You're not posting up pictures. So unless you're a genetic freak, and we can think of a few, fuck it, 25. And JD talks about it specifically. He says he spent 45 minutes out of a workout when he was competing, him and another buddy that was almost around the pro level, 45 minutes out of their workout, talking to guys about training, talking to them about the stuff that Steve and I cover all the time, talking about rest and recovery, talking about nutrition. And he's all that time out of his workout when he should have been training, should have been selfish, should have been concentrating. And when he thinks they've covered everything, the guy says, yes, but what are the secrets? Like drugs is the be all and end all. So it was kind of an annoying thing for him. And it touches back on what we talked about before. He liked to train because he enjoyed it. The banter in the gym with his mates was real. The drive to be a better bodybuilder was there because his buddies were in the gym kicking ass and competing. They probably went out for meals together. It's that sort of stuff that Arnold and that used to do with the gang back in the day. We seem to have lost. You might see it around the expos, you might see it around the big competitions, but typically you don't. And it's something that perhaps JD's correct in thinking, and that is have a love for this stuff. And if your buddy's kicking ass, even if he kicks your ass, he kicked your ass because a judge said so, not because he said so, because a judge said so. But go out and have some cheesecake with this man afterwards and celebrate his win, celebrate your second place, whatever. And don't take it personally. Have some banter, have some fun. If Stevesmi and I goof around something chronic after these podcasts are done, I'm 100% sure we do just the same if we meet up, perhaps with Body Monster and a couple of the other guys off the forum. There'll be a lot of joshing, there'll be a lot of leg pulling, there'll be a lot of banter, and then we'll all probably go down and hit the gym together and put on a fucking show for our mates. And let our buddies see that our fucking shit is real, and we'll really, really get into it and have a good time. That's also the kind of vibe that we like to have over on Evo and for these podcasts. So we want you guys out there to have some fun and enjoy yourself. Let's get into the PED, Steve. Back to you.
So over there in Britain, Mobster, maybe you could talk a little bit about it. It's a little different in the United States. United States, we have 49 out of 50 states where, it's illegal to mess around with steroids without a prescription. If you have a prescription, it's one thing, but without a prescription, it's another. Oregon is the only state where it's actually decriminalized to use steroids. So over there, it's different. And he was able to take advantage of it, JD, those laws. So over there in Britain, maybe you can touch on it a little bit. What are the steroid laws in Britain versus the United States?
I'll address this real quickly. I think there's a kind of, I've had to deal with both sides of the coin here. I've done a body power when an online buddy come up to me with a young lad. I'm talking about 12, 13 years of age, something like this. And I've always been open and honest. The only person I don't tell or talk about it in front of is my mum, just because no one wants their mum to tell them off. Doesn't matter how old you are. So I don't do it for that particular reason. But pretty much everybody else I've ever spoken to, brothers, my daughter, etc., there's a certain mentality because they see and maybe they respect you in a certain particular way. And I've occasionally had that. So if I go to a kind of health club type place or a sports center type place over here, a fitness center, similar to the YMCA type places you have in the States, though, and even what I would call the fitness market orientated gyms, and you've got Planet Fitness in the US, they tend to be a little bit standoffish about it. Ironically, because we talk about this on the forums, they'll smoke, they'll drink, they'll use medication, there'll be an antidepressants, but steroids. Whereas other gyms where people are more serious and more into their shit. And so my local gym, Powerhouse Aberdare, and where he trained, Muscleworks, I think if you come across in a certain serious way, you go there, you get your shit done, you lift in big poundages if you're a weightlifter, strength athlete like myself, or if you're a bodybuilder, you're getting ripped, you're putting your time on the cardio, you're serious about your nutrition, then it's more open. That's not to say that you have to judge it in terms of who you're talking to, etc., but I tend to find that people will gravitate towards me, possibly because of these kind of podcasts, how long I've been in the game, my size, my strength, and so on. And so I'm more likely to be approached by people asking questions, especially people that are closer to my age, certainly post 40. In the UK, very quickly, right? So we have the same rules and restrictions you do in the US in regards to posting or sending it across state lines and all that kind of stuff over here. So, for example, if I sent steroids to Steve and Steve lived in the next county, I would use the Royal Mail. And if I use the Royal Mail, it's against the law. I should not be sending steroids through the mail. On the other hand, but perversely, within the EU, that I can go abroad to a country where it's legal for me to buy over the counter, and I can bring that through customs, and providing I declare it and pay my tax on it, it's fine. It's very, very rare here in the UK. On paper, I think it might be true to say that I shouldn't have steroids in the house, and I could potentially be arrested for having steroids in the house. I could tell you maybe I can actually think of a couple of court cases that buddies were involved in where the amount of drugs that you're allowed to have has never been defined in law here in the UK, specifically when it comes to steroids. And so no one has ever been properly prosecuted and sent to jail for having a reasonable amount of steroids in the house for their own use. It's the sale and distribution, and specifically how it's distributed, that will get you into trouble. And of course, if you're selling it for profit, you're avoiding tax because you're not telling the tax man that you sold some steroids. So yeah, that particular side of things. And of course, again, it comes down to, it's probably the same as in the States. You're not having people that sell crack sell steroids. It just doesn't seem to work like that. You're not having people that sell meth selling steroids. Sometimes someone up the food chain is doing those two things together, but it's not, people don't stand on street corners selling vials of testosterone, and we're not out mugging grannies for vials of testosterone. And the UK government knows that, the lawful authorities know that, so they're not chasing us, they're not kicking us. In fact, I can only think of a couple of prosecution cases, and they actually relate to the police or a member of the police using steroids. And the one case I'm actually thinking of was a London Met Police officer came on up to South Wales, where I am, and meeting South Wales police, young other South Wales police officers, and there was a deal to be done, and internal affairs people arrested everybody, and they all got sacked and prosecuted for bringing the police service into disrepute. So they actually got more trouble with that than they did specifically for them using steroids. So it's there. It's one of those things that people don't like to have their noses rubbed in it, but equally, we're not as bothered by it, and it's not as big a legal issue as it is in the States, as you say. We're not getting people knocking on our doors and trying to do each pill of Dynabol is a count. It doesn't work like that here in the UK. And as then I said, specifically, the law that kind of protects us the most is that possession and personal use is seen as next to fuck all. It really is, because the law doesn't define how many amps of this you've got, how many volts of that you're allowed to have, or whatever else. You can have the few cases that I think of is where large amounts have been found, but distribution wasn't proved. So essentially, the prosecutions tried to come down to, listen, he's got 10,000 Dynabol pills, and because no one could prove that they wasn't for his use or her use, the cases have fallen apart, and they've actually wasted money and time, British government money or public money, prosecuting this particular person, because if you haven't got proof that they're selling and distributing, you're kind of screwed. So it's very, very rare, and there's a lot bigger fish, a lot worse drugs to chase people for, so we don't worry about it too much. That's not to say that obviously some people, they're uncomfortable with the whole idea of needles, and they don't like, you shouldn't have all your pills out on display and all that kind of stuff. That's about being responsible, of course, Dave, which I think applies no matter where you are. I don't care if you can buy it over the counter in Mexico or go to Greece and buy some sort of low-dose Anavar over the counter for the originals back in the day, even for children, as it was sometimes prescribed to back in the day. It's just common sense not to have this stuff lying around. And it also is, for me, and I think that still applies to you no matter what, people suddenly get this idea that the only reason you're big and the only reason you're muscular and the only reason you're strong is because of these pills, because of these tablets. So to go on about it too much, to have them laying around, would kind of negate the hard work and effort and the sheer time that you've put in. So there's that element too. We might talk about this stuff at the gym counter, but we're not talking about it all day. You're not fist bumping buddies and talking about testosterone when you're out for a walk and all that kind of stuff, because it takes away from everything else we do. And that everything else we do is 99% of it. Steroids should be a little bit more on top. Anyway, let's get on the actual cycle stuff, Steve, and on to you.
All right, guys. So JD, let's talk about what he would have ran around 2000, 2001 when he was peaking. And, so we can go through some steroids around that era. So one of the things they started doing, they started running more testosterone. So in Britain, one of the more popular testosterone versions is Sustanon 250.
Yeah.
So 3 cc's of that a week would not be unheard of. Maybe even 4 cc's up to 1,000. Of course, he's going to cut it off ahead of his competition. It's a very long ester. So he wants to make sure maybe about 4 or 5 weeks ahead of his competition, he's definitely going to stop it. And then he's also going to run along with it 100 milligrams a day of testosterone propionate. That gives him a little more flexibility so that with the propionate, he can run it up until 10 days to 2 weeks ahead of his competition. And then he would stop taking it. By the time the competition comes around, hopefully almost all that testosterone is out of his system. So he doesn't want that blow. He doesn't want the loose look to his muscles. Another one he would have ran around this era is Masteron propionate, 150 milligrams a day, pretty huge dosage. Wouldn't be surprising if he ran even more ahead of the competition. Now, Masteron is a DHT derivative, very cosmetic drug used in concurrence with the other steroids in a cycle like this. What it's going to do is it's going to harden up your muscles incredibly well, more than any other steroid. When I've run Masteron, I've gone to a massage therapist and she's massaging me and she tells me, she's like, look, I've never massaged anyone who had harder muscles than you. And I'm like, well, that's the Masteron. Felt like I was sleeping on bricks when I would use Masteron.
Steve, I just want to jump.
Yep.
I just want to jump in here, Steve. You sure that's exactly what she said, or should you just mention how hard you was?
Exactly. It's just like the Deshaun Watson situation for sure.
Yeah, that's it.
Next one is Equipoise, EQ. Boldenone is also what it's called. 800 milligrams a week. This will be around the time where they started messing around with EQ. They went away from DECA. They shied away from DECA. They transitioned more to Equipoise. And then the next one I want to talk about before I bring in Mobster to cover the other drugs he would have ran was Trenbolone. So Trenbolone got popular in the 90s. Phenaplix, Parabolin, and then Trenbolone. Acetate, 500 milligrams a week. Wouldn't surprise me if they ran more. I know since then, the past 20 years, they've used Trenbolone like crazy ahead of competitions. It is the king of all steroids. If you want to keep up with your competition, you better be running Trenbolone. So that's what these guys were doing. These are the main steroids that they were running. Different testosterone esters, Masteron, Equipoise, Trenbolone. This was the main steroid. So Mobster, tell us a little bit more about the next set of drugs in things that they would be using to help them in competitions around this time.
I'll touch on the Tren again, actually. I think this is one of the few things where we've talked about, and I mentioned in the previous podcast, how sometimes there's this idea that different sides of the Atlantic, whether it's the Russian or the UK or the Americans, are doing something different. And I said, in reality, there was always like a sort of this idea that it was some secret that they were doing, and you could learn by buying this booklet from the back of a magazine. And as I say, I touched on that in the previous podcast. This is one of the few times when I think we was behind the Americans, in that we would get some of that inside information, especially amongst the competitive guys coming back from competing in the States, and they would talk to their American buddies and they would find out what they were doing. But again, I mean, we've talked about 90s bodybuilders before, and the American guys got into a trend first, And even when the UK guys were using tren, I think we were using less. So the idea, for example, as a suggested cycle here, as a 90s bodybuilder like JD was using 500 milligrams a week of tren, we know that as bad as the side effects are, and if you can't handle it, it's really going to be bad. It's not unusual to see a lot higher, even in the 90s with the American bodybuilders. So I think the amount is kind of accurate in that it's less than a 90s bodybuilder like JD would have been had he lived in the States, had he been an American bodybuilder. So we were behind the curve in A, getting it, and B, in the amounts that we were using compared to what the American guys that have come across tren, and then, of course, how much they were using when they were based in the States. So that's 100% there. But as Steve has said in many podcasts, tren is, and I quote, of the king of steroids. It's kind of like, sometimes it's slightly annoying that guys aren't ready for tren or using tren because they want to be in that kind of classification. But for me, tren is one of those, build your way up to it and only do it when you're really serious about your shit. Getting strong, getting hard, getting muscular, thinking of being competitive, looking like someone who looks like a proper muscular bodybuilder. And that's the kind of vibe for me that's where it should be. That's what it should be about. In terms of the suggested amounts here, we're getting to the growth hormone. Again, lower than the numbers that we see nowadays, kind of around the number that you would have seen for a professional bodybuilder for JD, and again of the time, which is a suggested 10 IUs. It's still higher than 95% of our listeners should be using. I favor 2.5 IUs a day because you tend to have less issues with, excuse me, water retention on carpal tunnel. Slightly more than that if you're a bit more serious about dropping body fat. And again, best used in conjunction with testosterone and other steroids. Any higher than that, and you're going to have the potential for side effects. There are ways, of course, of negating it that involves more drugs. I like to keep things real simple. And again, we're talking about a 90s bodybuilder here. So his cycle would have been kind of simple, but for competitive reasons, for being an in-shape bodybuilder, for the thinning out of that skin that I touched upon earlier in the podcast, 10 IUs a day as a part of a competition cycle. Diuretics were 100% a 90s 2000 drug in terms of rearing their ugly head. They hadn't really been something that was talked about. People would do stuff like dandelion root or whatever way back in the day. And maybe a few 70s and 80s bodybuilders had touched upon this stuff. But you can look at the physiques, you can see when the differences came, you can see when that kind of grainy look started to appear, you can see when the skin got thinner and thinner and thinner from, say, for example, a bodybuilder like Arnold or Dave Draper back in the day versus the sharper, drier guys that started to appear in the 90s. So the level of diuretics and the use of diuretics become more common amongst the pros at that particular time. Letrozole, Steve and I have talked about this, and it's kind of one of those histories of bodybuilding type things where we say you can kind of see where the sport's changed in terms of the diuretics, as I just said, in terms of the more virulent, tough to deal with fat burners, which we're going to address in a second, and also in terms of the AIs. So, for example, back in the day, Novadex was pretty much it. There wasn't really much of anything else around, and just because the amounts we were using were less, you saw less side effects, of course. Later on, when those amounts went up, but the AIs still hadn't come along in the way that they have now, you would see more bitch tits, you might see more water retention, and so on and so forth. And so a drug like letrozole would have came along. It would have probably been available to doctors for medical reasons prior to that, but the bodybuilders realized that they could use this to reduce the estrogenic effects of taking the steroids to lean out, to not have water retention, and hopefully deal with any bitch tits that they might have. Steve is way more of an expert than I am when it comes to that side of things. And something which we've touched upon again, and we mentioned in this podcast all the time, DNP. Now, of course, as per usual, we get the warning, whether you like it or not. We are not fans of DNP. We think it's a dangerous drug. And if you're a normal guy, 9 times out of 10, even if you use it as described, and that doesn't always happen, and that's where the danger lies, getting lean is fine, but a lot of the guys, and again, it's that 9 times out of 10 thing, a lot of the guys get back everything they had before when they stopped using the DP, and then they seem to add a little bit more. So if you had a lot of water and a lot of fat, and the DNP helped you lose it, You get all that water and all that fat back. If you haven't got genetics like JD, if you haven't got genetics like a top pro, and your body doesn't respond in that particular way, it responds like an average man, a normal Joe, a typical guy that goes to the gym. DMP is not for you. And that's without getting to the super crazy, what the hell side effects. But unfortunately for the sport, such as it was, 90s bodybuilders, specifically more, I would say probably towards the mid to end of 90s, DMP, and not mentioned here, Steve, Nubane, which was on both sides of the Atlantic, unfortunately. Both those drugs seemed to come into the sport, and both of those drugs ended up causing a lot of problems. One of the things that came off of DMP, which kind of came away from bodybuilding, was that it was being sold as a fat loss drug to normal people. And when they started importing this stuff in unlabeled, with zero guidance, Ziploc bags from China and other places, that's when you started to see the stupidity of people doubling and tripling the dose when they'd never used the drug before. And that's when you would see, as we saw at that particular time, I believe early 2000s, when we saw deaths mentioned in the national press on both sides of the Atlantic. People would get this thing where they were already unhealthy, they were all massively overweight, they had no kind of fitness thing going on, and they were looking for an extreme way of losing this fat. And the recommended dosage, without mentioning particulars, off the top of my head, one number that springs to mind is 200 milligrams for an average person. But you need to look into this stuff, guys, if you are going to use it. And again, we don't recommend it. So if someone there says, well, 200 helped me lose, 400 is going to help me lose more. Well, if you're an out of shape, out of condition, overweight, obese person, male or female, and you double up on a dosage of something that can already cause you problems, then you're obviously going to cause yourself more problems. And I can think of two examples, both females, one Afro-Caribbean young lady, and another one was Caucasian. And in both, neither girl was massively overweight. They were literally just trying to get rid of the little bit of belly fat or whatever else, and they double up and they died. And it's one of those drugs where, you know, you don't get an initial effect straight away. You take more. Diuretics can do this, and you end up with a situation where the drug hasn't started kicking in yet, and you're taking more drugs because you haven't felt anything. And unfortunately, you're just building up to a level in your gym which become toxic, or in their case, lethally toxic. So it's a drug that we don't recommend. But yes, I suspect that people like JD would have at that time, and we're not saying JD specifically, but around that time, bodybuilders, UK bodybuilders and American bodybuilders, DMP was there. It was on the table. It would have been something they experimented with. I'm going to say now, Steve, I think I would probably get to my $10 safely betted and win the money back quite easily, that there'll be an awful lot of pro bodybuilders that would have tried it, and an awful lot of pro bodybuilders that realize it wasn't quite the miracle drug that they're expecting it to be. So we've got the Mr. Olympia of the weekend, again, as this podcast has been recorded. Diuretics for sure, but DMP, no. I don't think it's as common as a lot of forum members across all the forums involved in bodybuilding think it is amongst the pros. Diuretics, 100%. That's why you'll see a difference between the Friday and Saturday night shows with Open Mr. Olympia, for example. But you won't see, I think DMP was something that they all tried, and especially around this time, and some have completely dropped. Some maybe literally in the last couple of weeks. But for my money, I think my $10 would be safe if I said some of the pros have tried it, see how bad it was, didn't really work for them, and it was on the table, got knocked off the table. It was just not worth the effort and not worth the aggravation and not worth the sides. Unlike Trent, for example, with those horrible sides, you're still going to get muscle. You're still going to have, I mean, Steve's touches on this, and I shall ask him to jump back in. Steve, tell people what it's like with the side effects and how good and how bad Trent was. I think you said before, you said some of your best weights lifted were on trend, your best muscle size was on trend, but equally some of the worst side effects you had was on trend.
Yeah, and with trend, the first few weeks, you're like, wow, this stuff is incredible. By week 4, you're starting to get those trend pumps when you work out. It's brutal.
Too much.
And then by week 5, week 6, you're just like miserable on the stuff all day. But the strength and the mass gains that you get on trend are incredible, but it destroys your cardio, your endurance. You feel like shit on it. It just feels like a nonstop dehydration. It just feels like you're dehydrated 24/7. You wake up in the morning with morning sickness because you're so dehydrated in the morning. It's miserable. So same thing with DMP. Mobster talked about DMP. DMP is just a miserable chemical.
Yellow sweat. Yellow sweat, have glasses of ice water with you at all time. Literally, the sweat that's coming out of your body, people, can be yellow. It's the body is trying to get rid of the poison, and you're literally sweating it out. You feel like you're burning up from the inside. And with Tren, we've just said, you're going to get more muscle if you use it right. You're going to get stronger if you use it right. You're going to have those crazy pumps if you use it right, like Steve said. DMP, to me, is just like, you just sit there and do nothing and feel awful. And worse, at least again with the Tren, you'll keep some of that muscle that you gain. You'll keep some of that strength you gain. With DMP, as often as not, what you lost, what was the aim of using it, getting lean, getting in shape, ends up coming back to you twofold. So all of that fat, say you drop 20 pounds, you gain 22 pounds back on. At least when we take some steroids and we say go up 20 pounds, we keep 5 or 10 pounds of the muscle tissue. Trends like that, Debo, lots of these steroids are like that. With DMP, for most users, it's lose 20 pounds, gain 22 pounds back after you stop using it. And that's why sitting there, burning up and leaking yellow sweat out of your body, Steve. It's just horrible drug.
Yeah, it really is, guys. Sorry about the delay there. Yeah, it really is. And on DMP, when you eat a carb meal, you just go into a sweat. And it really is a miserable way to lose fat. And the thing is, you're crashing your metabolism so much that any fat that you lose on the DMP, you're retaining a lot of water on it. That's your body's mechanism to fight off, and you're having a huge drop in metabolism on the stuff as well. So what ends up happening is when you come off, the water retention comes out, and then you look really, really lean. That's your peak. And then your metabolism has crashed so much that you start eating food as you've been doing, and you basically gain everything back and more when you come on it. So it's a crappy way. It's a shitty way to lose fat. But guys, especially in that time, they did what they needed to do to look good on the show day. You got to look good on the show day. They're not worried about their intermediate or long-term, what they look like. They're not worried about their health. They call it the off season. Any rebound and fat gain, they call that the off season. Then they comp to get back into shape. And this is what JD was doing. You see JD in the off season, he was up to 270 pounds. He wouldn't be able to compete at 270 pounds. So this is the way it works. It's a roller coaster. So, that's what they did, guys. That's what we're telling you guys he did. So Mobster, finish out your final thoughts and then give a preview of our next show and take us into the disclaimer.
Okay, so one more thing on regards to this cycle, guys. If you look at the numbers here, they're almost kind of reasonable. And it shows you the difference between cycles back in the day, which is, say, mid-90s here, when I think JD was with the 80s peak up to the early 2000s, but certainly the early 90s, which is kind of what I think this cycle is a complete difference in terms of the numbers and the volumes and the number of products, the numbers of milligrams, etc. So it's almost, with regards to certainly contractose, DMP, and perhaps the diuretics, almost a healthy cycle, and especially for a pro bodybuilder. My thoughts are with JD, and I'm thinking again of this video that both Steve and I referred to in the article and we did in our pre-show research. JD did what he did because he loved it, and that's what you should do. I don't care if your thing is table tennis, poker. Poker's probably a good example with regards to the gambling side. You should enjoy what you do, and you should do something like bodybuilding because you love it. So some of the fun that you get should be from going to the gym. Some of that might even be BSing with your buddies down the gym and the vibe. What happens now, especially with the lifestyles that we have and the stress and social media and work and the nature of work, especially with regards to getting down the gym when the gym's crazy or when the gym's empty. I'm able to go in the mornings, even when I don't train here, when I go to the local gym, but especially when I was at the local gym on a regular basis, go and chew the fat with the boys. It was almost a social thing for me as well as hitting the weights. And then when I'm in competition, when I'm in that mindset, especially back in the day for me, the vibe amongst my buddies, the vibes amongst the people that surround me, especially if they're competitive too, was on. It was a good time, and that's what JD talks about as well. Have fun with it. Have fun with your buddies. Love what you do. So there's your message for it. Right. What's coming up? I've mentioned 2 or 3 times already. It's Olympia weekend. Today is the Saturday as we record this, and tonight is the night show. Right now, we've got Ramy and Brandon Curry going head to head. Brandon seems to be being the lead yesterday, so the next show will be a post-Olympia podcast. And we'll be focusing on Ramy because he's the, hopefully, maybe, in my opinion, if nothing else, guy is going to win tonight, certainly because he was last year's winner, so he'll be the focus, but we'll, of course, touch on the Olympia as a whole. So there you go. Right, as always, guys, you get the disclaimer. Please note, we are not doctors, and the opinions we do on this podcast are ours and ours alone. It's our view and based on the experience and views that we've had on this topic come from many, many years. And podcasts are for informational purposes and entertainment only. The freedom of speech and the First Amendment rule applies.